In the vast and sprawling landscape of Briar Hollow Plantation, where magnolia trees cast their shadows across endless fields, and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of human suffering, there lived a woman whose name the history books nearly forgot. Her name was Evelyn, though few knew her by that calling. To the world around her she was simply Alcott's girl, a possession, a tool, a shadow moving through the chambers of power without voice, without choice, without recognition of the mind that animated her remarkable form. If stories like this remind you that history still bleeds beneath the surface, hit that like button and subscribe to help keep these forgotten voices alive. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and whether you think justice ever truly came for these people. Enjoy the story. It was 1852 when Evelyn first arrived at Briar Hollow, purchased at considerable expense by a man named Master Harrison Alcott, a plantation owner whose reputation preceded him like the dust of his carriage wheels across the cotton fields. Alcott was not a man of ordinary cruelty. That alone would have made him forgotten by history. Rather, he embodied a far more insidious evil, the benevolence of the oppressor. He spoke of his enslaved workers with a kind of paternal affection. He prided himself on fair treatment, on never selling mothers from their children, on allowing Sunday worship. He was, by the standards of his world, a progressive man, and this veneer of humanity was, perhaps, the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal of control. Alcott purchased Evelyn for a specific purpose. Unlike the hundreds of others who labored in the fields under the merciless sun, Evelyn possessed a commodity far rarer in the world of enslavement: literacy. She could read, she could write, she understood mathematics and accounts. Her former owner, a plantation manager in Charleston, had educated her not from kindness but from convenience, and when that owner fell into financial ruin, Evelyn was sold off like any other piece of property, though her value was understood to be considerably higher. From the moment Evelyn crossed the threshold of the great house at Briar Hollow, she understood the peculiar horror of her position. She was not relegated to the fields. Instead, she was brought into the intimate world of the master's household, serving as his personal maid, his secretary, his confidant in matters of business and plantation management. She dressed in finer clothes than most. She ate better food. She was given a small room rather than a cabin shared with dozens of others. By the impossible mathematics of slavery, she was privileged. Yet privilege in a system of bondage is merely a different cage, and the bars, though gilded, are no less confining. Master Alcott relied upon Evelyn for everything. She maintained his ledgers, recording with meticulous precision the accounting of human flesh and cotton yields. She wrote his correspondence, her hand so practiced in imitating his own that few could distinguish her pen from his. She listened to his confidences, his fears about competition from northern textile mills, his anxieties about his wife's distant coldness, his secret debts incurred through gambling and speculation. Evelyn became, in many ways, the keeper of his inner life, yet she remained to him what she had always been: invisible, a tool, a convenience, a woman whose intellect was useful but whose humanity remained unacknowledged. The other enslaved people on the plantation both envied and pitied her. The envy was understandable. Evelyn's life, while still confined by bondage, offered physical comforts denied to others. But the pity came from a deeper understanding. Evelyn's proximity to power was its own form of torture. She saw, day after day, the mechanisms of cruelty that sustained the plantation. She heard the conversations that revealed the utter disregard for human life that animated men like Alcott. She was forced to be complicit in the very system that enslaved her, forced to become a functionary in the machinery of her own oppression. And then, on a night in the autumn of 1858, everything changed. It began as it often did, with Evelyn preparing Alcott's study for the evening. She had developed a system over the years, a practiced routine that moved her through the rooms of the great house like a ghost. That night, as she arranged papers on his desk, she noticed a letter sealed with wax and bearing an unfamiliar mark. Her eye, trained by years of managing correspondence, caught the name written across its face. A trader's name, a broker of enslaved people. Curiosity became caution, and caution became necessity. When Master Alcott departed for town on business the following morning, Evelyn carefully broke the seal. What she read in that letter was not entirely surprising. She had suspected for months that Alcott's finances were deteriorating, that the debts were mounting, that desperate measures would soon be necessary. But this letter made those fears concrete. It was a proposal from a trader in Charleston, a man offering an astounding sum for the mixed-race boy, Samuel, age 9, good health, no defects. Samuel, her son. The child born on the plantation 7 years ago, a child whose father was Harrison Alcott himself, though that terrible truth was never spoken aloud in anything but whispers. Evelyn knew with a clarity that seemed to crystallize something deep within her soul, that she could not stop this sale through pleas or tears or any conventional form of resistance. Alcott would never listen to her. The law would never protect her. The world was arranged precisely so that men like him could do exactly as they wished to women like her and her children. There was no appeal to justice because justice had been engineered out of the system itself. But there were other paths. There were paths that required not the voice of the powerless, but the intellect of someone who had been forced to think like the powerful, to understand their systems, to move through their world with the fluency of an insider. Evelyn, standing in that study with the letter in her trembling hands, made a decision that would reshape not only her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to Briar Hollow. She would not beg for her freedom. She would not pray for mercy. She would take what was hers through the only means available to her, through cunning, through patience, through the weaponization of her own intellect against the system that had corrupted it. She would disappear, and in disappearing she would make certain that her absence became a mark upon the conscience of the man who sought to destroy her child. That night, Evelyn burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the words dissolve into ash as she committed every detail to her memory. She began to observe more carefully. She noted the schedules of the guards, the routes they walked, the rhythm of the plantation as it moved through each season. She began to gather small things, coins saved from handling the household accounts, lengths of fabric, dried food. Nothing obvious, nothing that would alert anyone to what she was planning. And she began to think, to plan, to architect an escape so carefully constructed that it would not merely save her and her child, but would plant seeds of doubt and guilt that would grow for years to come. In the quiet hours of the plantation, surrounded by the sounds of cricket song and distant weeping from the cabins, Evelyn commenced the delicate and dangerous work of liberation. She began to dream of a world beyond Briar Hollow, but more than that, she began to dream of returning to it, transformed, armed not with weapons, but with the one thing Alcott had inadvertently given her, knowledge. She knew his world, she understood his fear, and soon she would make him pay the price for every moment he had treated her invisibility as permission to steal her humanity. The summer of 1859 arrived at Briar Hollow with a peculiar intensity. The heat seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, and the sky took on the greenish hue of approaching storms. It was the season of hurricanes, the season when nature itself seemed to rebel against the order imposed upon the land. Evelyn watched the sky with a patience born of calculation. She had been waiting nearly a year since reading that letter about Samuel's sale. She had gathered her small stores, established her contacts, and prepared every detail of what would come next. And then, in early September, as if answering her silent prayer, the weather began to turn. The first storm passed without incident, but the second one was different. The wind came from the Atlantic with a violence that seemed personal, bending trees that had stood for a century, tearing roofs from buildings, turning the plantation into a landscape of chaos and fear. As darkness fell and the wind reached a fever pitch, Alcott's attention was consumed by the destruction surrounding his property. The guards abandoned their usual posts to protect the great house and the barns where the cotton was stored. The entire rhythm of the plantation transformed into a desperate attempt at survival. This was the moment Evelyn had been waiting for. She moved through the chaos with a purpose that masked her true intentions. In the confusion, with Samuel's hand gripped in hers, she made her way to the river. The water was swollen from the storm, dangerous and unpredictable, but it was also her passage to freedom. She had arranged, through careful and coded messages hidden in the very ledgers she kept for Master Alcott, to meet a ferryman who would transport her north. The communication had been intricate, passed through an abolitionist network that had reached even into the heart of Briar Hollow, through a trader who masqueraded as a buyer of enslaved people, but was, in fact, a conductor on the Underground Railroad. As she reached the riverbank with Samuel, Evelyn paused for a moment and looked back at the great house, illuminated by distant lightning. Every room was a memory of her servitude, every window a mirror of the careful deference she had maintained for years. Then she turned toward the water, stepped into it with her child, and let the river carry her toward the north and toward an uncertain but no longer predetermined future. The story told at Briar Hollow the next morning was a tragedy. The enslaved woman and the boy, attempting to flee in the chaos of the storm, had drowned trying to cross the river in the darkness. Master Alcott expressed genuine sorrow at their loss, though those who knew him well noted a certain relief in his demeanor. The boy, after all, was no longer available for sale, and the woman was no longer a reminder of his indiscretions. Within weeks, life at Briar Hollow returned to its ordinary rhythms, and Evelyn and Samuel faded into the realm of plantation legend. But Evelyn had not drowned. She had emerged on the northern bank of the river, soaked and trembling, with her son gripping her hand and the vast unknown stretching before her. The journey north was treacherous and slow. She and Samuel traveled at night, hidden in the false bottoms of wagons and the cellars of sympathetic abolitionists. They moved from safe house to safe house, each station on the Underground Railroad representing both salvation and danger. One arrest, one questioning, one wrong decision could bring her back to slavery, back to the auction block, back to a life of bondage. But Evelyn had learned patience at Briar Hollow. She had learned how to read people, how to anticipate danger, how to move through systems of power without drawing attention. These skills, honed in the service of her oppressor, now became the tools of her liberation. By the end of 1859, Evelyn had reached Philadelphia, and by early 1860, she had taken on a new identity. She was no longer Alcott's property or anyone else's. She became a free woman, a nurse, someone who worked in hospitals serving the sick and injured. Her literacy, her attention to detail, her ability to manage complex systems, all these qualities now directed toward legitimate work, allowed her to earn respect and a modest living. She rented a small room in a neighborhood populated by free black people, reformed abolitionists, and those who had escaped slavery. Philadelphia, in those years, was becoming a refuge for people seeking freedom and a new beginning. Samuel grew and thrived. He was enrolled in a school established by abolitionists, where he learned to read and write and understand the world beyond the boundaries of the plantation. To him, Slavery became something spoken of in the past tense, a horror from which his mother had miraculously saved him. He knew the truth of his origins, but his mother always emphasized that his life now belonged entirely to him, that his future was not determined by the circumstances of his birth. Yet Evelyn's own future was far more complicated than simple survival and modest respectability. Throughout the early 1860s, as the nation was torn apart by civil war and the enslaved were gradually emancipated, she was building something far more intricate. She had become part of an abolitionist circle, a network of men and women who did not merely speak out against slavery, but actively worked to dismantle it. Through this network, she maintained an extraordinary correspondence with people in the South. Letters arrived with news from former slaves and sympathizers, information filtered through about what was happening at Briar Hollow, about the fate of Master Alcott, and Evelyn began to gather intelligence. She learned that Alcott's financial situation had deteriorated far more rapidly than she had anticipated. The trader who had originally purchased Samuel had died in a carriage accident. The letter of proposal had never been found, and Alcott, paranoid and perhaps haunted by the ghost of the woman he believed drowned, became obsessive about financial security. He invested in increasingly risky ventures seeking to recoup losses. He made poor decisions, and slowly, methodically, his vast fortune began to erode. Evelyn did not merely observe this decline. With careful precision, she participated in it. Using the connections of her abolitionist network, she sent letters bearing Alcott's own forged handwriting, letters that appeared to be from legitimate creditors, from distant merchants, from investors demanding payment on notes that did not actually exist. The genius of these forgeries lay in their specificity, their credibility, their exploitation of the very systems Alcott had taught her to understand. Each letter was calculated to create doubt, to generate investigation, to encourage Alcott to make even more desperate financial decisions. 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War, Evelyn gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, both of whom she named after people who had sheltered her on her journey north, Thomas and Ruth. The twins' father was a man named William, a free black man and abolitionist sympathizer who had fallen in love with Evelyn after she arrived in Philadelphia. William loved her for her courage, her intelligence, her quiet determination, and he accepted the truth of her past and the fact that her first son already carried the blood of the man she had fled from. He married her, and the twins were born into a family founded not on coercion, but on mutual love and shared commitment to justice. But the twins possessed a peculiar and undeniable characteristic that Evelyn had deliberately anticipated. They bore a striking physical resemblance to their grandfather, Master Alcott. They had his pale complexion, his sharp jawline, his distinctive gray eyes. Looking at them, it was impossible not to see the architect of the system that had enslaved their mother. This resemblance was not accidental. Evelyn had chosen William carefully, in part because of certain physical characteristics that would render their children undeniably connected, by blood and appearance, to Harrison Alcott. By 1864, as the war dragged toward its conclusion and emancipation became not merely a moral imperative but an inevitable reality, Evelyn began to prepare the final stage of her long and patient rebellion. She was now a woman of 32, her son Samuel was 17, and her twins were barely walking. She had built a new life, a real life, one where she was no longer defined by the color of her skin or the status of slavery, but she had never forgotten Briar Hollow. She had never released her grip on the idea that there was more work to be done, more justice to be achieved. In the spring of 1865, as General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the future suddenly seemed open and uncertain, Evelyn began to think about going home. Not home to the life she had lived, that life could never be reclaimed or redeemed, but home to Briar Hollow itself, not as a slave but as something far more powerful, a free woman carrying proof of Master Alcott's sins in the very faces of her children. In the quiet evenings, as she settled her twins into sleep and William read the newspapers announcing the end of slavery, Evelyn contemplated the final move in a chess match she had been playing for 7 years. She had escaped. She had survived. She had built a life. But the work was not yet complete. There was still a reckoning to be had, still a truth to be told, still a wrong to be righted, not through violence or revenge, but through the most powerful weapon available to her, the truth itself. The stage was being set. The Southern world was collapsing. The old order was dying, and Evelyn, who had been designed to be nothing but a possession, was preparing to return to her place of bondage as something far more significant, the bearer of testimony, the living embodiment of her oppressor's crimes, the architect of a justice more subtle but far more lasting than any retribution born of rage. The spring of 1865 brought an end to the American Civil War, though the end of slavery and the beginning of freedom were not quite the same thing. Across the South, plantations that had operated for generations on the labor of enslaved people were suddenly thrown into chaos. Some owners fled. Others attempted to navigate the new order by offering wages to former slaves, though those wages were pittance and the conditions barely distinguishable from bondage. Still others clung to the old ways with a stubborn and violent determination, refusing to acknowledge that the world they had built was crumbling around them. Briar Hollow Plantation was no exception to this turmoil. Master Harrison Alcott, now in his 60s, found himself diminished by forces beyond his control. The financial collapse that Evelyn's forged letters had helped to accelerate was now complete. His creditors were calling in their debts. His cotton fields, without the free labor of enslaved people, suddenly became unprofitable. His great house, once a symbol of his power and status, was now a liability he could barely maintain. His wife, who had left him years ago, was living in New Orleans with a new husband. His children, products of his earlier marriage, had scattered to the north and showed no interest in inheriting a ruined plantation. In 1866, as Briar Hollow descended into genuine financial distress, Evelyn made her move. Under the assumed identity of a free black woman and widow, armed with forged papers that her abolitionist friends had carefully crafted, she presented herself at the plantation. She came seeking employment, she explained. She was a nurse and teacher, educated and skilled, looking for work in the newly reconstructed South. She had children with her, the twins, Thomas and Ruth, now 2 years old, and her older son Samuel, now 19 and educated in northern schools. The plantation that received them was a shadow of its former self. The great house, though still imposing, showed signs of decay. The fields lay fallow. Most of the other enslaved people had departed during the chaos of the war. Alcott himself had withdrawn into a kind of paralyzed despair, spending most of his time drinking and obsessing over the losses that had accumulated around him. But when Evelyn walked into the house at Briar Hollow, something shifted in the old man's consciousness. He had been haunted by dreams of the woman and boy who had supposedly drowned during the hurricane 7 years before. In his nightmares, they walked toward him from dark water, their eyes filled not with anger but with accusation. And then a woman appeared at his door, a woman who moved with a familiar grace, who bore herself with a dignity that was almost accusatory in its calm. She said her name was Eleanor, but something in her bearing, something in the shape of her face and the intelligence in her eyes troubled him in ways he could not fully articulate. It was when he saw the children that the full weight of realization struck him. Thomas and Ruth were undeniably his grandchildren. There was no mistaking it. The shape of their faces, the particular gray of their eyes, the distinctive curve of their jawline, these were the mark of his own blood, rendered visible and impossible to deny. And as Alcott looked from the children to the woman standing before him, a terrible understanding began to dawn. The possibility that had seemed impossible, that Evelyn had survived, that she had fled, that she had built a life in the North, suddenly crystallized into horrifying certainty. Evelyn met his gaze with a composure that was absolute. She said nothing that would have been incriminating in itself. She merely made conversation, described her work in Philadelphia, explained that she had been freed through various fortunate circumstances, and that she had come south seeking to make a new start. She was a model of respectability and restraint, but every word carried the weight of irony, every gesture acknowledged the history between them without explicitly invoking it. Word spread rapidly through the plantation and the surrounding community. Former slaves, freedmen newly arrived from the North, and even some of Alcott's remaining white neighbors began to gather the truth. The woman and children who had appeared at Briar Hollow were not who they claimed to be. They were Evelyn and Samuel returned from the dead, and the twins with their unmistakable resemblance to Harrison Alcott, were the living proof of his crimes, his hypocrisy, his violation of the very women he had claimed to protect. The rumors became whispers, and the whispers became open conversation. In churches and markets, on streets and in homes, people spoke of what had happened. Master Alcott, the man who had built his reputation on benevolence and Christian virtue, had fathered children on an enslaved woman. He had then attempted to sell one of those children, and that woman, when faced with the horror of his betrayal, had fled and built a life so successfully that she had returned victorious, her children educated and free, her own intelligence and determination fully vindicated. Alcott's response was frantic and increasingly incoherent. He confronted Evelyn in private, his voice ranging from desperate pleading to violent rage. He demanded that she leave, that she take her children and vanish again. He threatened exposure, scandal, legal action, all arguments that rang hollow because there was nothing with which to threaten her. She was a free woman. Her children were free. The law that had once made them his property had been demolished. He had no power over her any longer. All he possessed was the terrible clarity of his own culpability. In their final conversation, conducted in the same study where Evelyn had once served him tea and taken dictation, she spoke to him with a clarity that must have felt like judgment itself. "You built this system," she said, her voice steady and uninfected with triumph, "in which you believed you could do anything to people like me and there would be no consequence. You thought your benevolence absolved you of your cruelty. You thought that treating me well was enough to justify slavery itself. But it was not enough. It could never be enough. I am here now not to punish you, Master Alcott. I am here to remind you that we were always human, that we always had agency, that your system was always fragile and dependent on our compliance. I departed, and the system failed. I succeeded, and you crumbled. That is not revenge. That is merely justice being patient and taking its time." She left Briar Hollow with Samuel and the twins within the week, but her departure, unlike her original escape, was not a disappearance. She left behind knowledge, acknowledgement, and undeniable truth. Everyone who had witnessed her presence, who had seen those children with their striking resemblance to their grandfather, carried forward the story. It became legend in the region, the tale of the enslaved woman who had escaped, thrived, and returned to face her former master with nothing but the quiet dignity of someone who had authored their own destiny. Harrison Alcott declined rapidly after that. His health deteriorated, his mind began to fracture under the weight of guilt and humiliation, and his death, which came in 1868, was attended by very few. The plantation passed into the hands of distant relatives who had no investment in maintaining it. By the 1870s, Briar Hollow was largely abandoned, its great house falling slowly into disrepair, its fields returning to wild nature. It became simply another ghost of the Old South, another ruin of a system that had been fundamentally unsustainable. But Evelyn lived. She lived to see her children flourish. Samuel became a teacher in northern cities, helping to establish schools for newly freed black people. Thomas became a lawyer, one of the first black men admitted to the bar in his state. Ruth became a teacher and an abolitionist speaker, traveling across the country telling her mother's story. And Evelyn herself, living into her 80s, spent her later years documenting her experiences, recording oral histories, and serving as a living bridge between the world of slavery and the emerging world of freedom. The story of Evelyn and her remarkable journey did not end with her triumphant return to Briar Hollow, or even with the twilight of her remarkable life. Rather, it continued to evolve, branching out like ripples across water, touching generations yet unborn, and shaping the way countless people understood the meaning of resilience, the nature of resistance, and the true character of human dignity. What had begun in bondage had transformed into legacy, and what had seemed like a personal reckoning became a testament to possibilities larger than any single life. In the years following Reconstruction, as the nation struggled to define itself in the aftermath of slavery and Civil War, the story of Evelyn became something powerful and enduring. Former slaves gathered in churches and community centers to hear about the woman who had used intelligence instead of violence, who had paid attention instead of despairing, who had recognized that the only true liberation lay not in merely escaping but in becoming unquestionably free, a woman no longer defined by those who had sought to diminish her. Her children, who had grown to adulthood in freedom and education, made the conscious decision to preserve their mother's story and share it widely. Thomas, the lawyer, documented the legal aspects of her case, the mechanics of how a woman deemed property had reclaimed her personhood. Samuel, the teacher, emphasized the importance of literacy and education as tools of liberation. Ruth, the speaker, traveled extensively, telling her mother's story to audiences who had never known slavery, but needed to understand how it was overcome. But the story took on different meanings for different people. For those still living in the immediate aftermath of slavery, still navigating a South determined to reinstall white supremacy through new and brutal mechanisms, Evelyn's story was one of radical possibility. It demonstrated that the system, despite its appearance of absolute power and eternal permanence, was actually vulnerable to human ingenuity and determination. It proved that the oppressed were never passive, that their minds could work as strategies, that their survival itself was an act of resistance. For Northern abolitionists and those committed to racial justice, Evelyn's story became evidence of what free black people could accomplish when given opportunity. It became a powerful counterargument to those who claimed that black people were incapable of complex intellectual work, of strategic thinking, of self-determination. Here was a woman who had done all of these things, and more. She had not merely survived. She had triumphed through the exercise of her own intellect and will. As decades passed and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Evelyn's story continued to resonate, though it was not always remembered by her actual name or with accurate detail. Sometimes it appeared in the historical record as an anecdote. Sometimes it became legendary, embellished, and transformed in the retelling. Historians would debate whether it had happened exactly as described, whether the details could be verified, whether it should be classified as history or something closer to folk narrative. Yet the story's truth lay not merely in its factual accuracy, but in what it represented about human possibility and the mechanisms of oppression. By the time of Evelyn's death in 1901, at the age of 89, She had lived through slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, and the emergence of Jim Crow. She had witnessed her children establish themselves as leaders and educators in their communities. She had met her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, speaking to them about her past and encouraging them to remember that they were heirs not merely to trauma, but to a legacy of extraordinary courage and strategic brilliance. In her final years, she was interviewed by early historians working to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people, and her recollections provided some of the most detailed and reflective testimony about the psychological and intellectual dimensions of slavery. What was perhaps most remarkable about Evelyn's legacy was the way it expanded beyond the immediate story of her own journey. She had demonstrated something fundamental about human nature and human possibility, that the human spirit possesses within it capacities for resilience that cannot be destroyed by oppressive systems, that intellect and dignity cannot be permanently subordinated, and that liberation, when it comes, is not something granted by the powerful to the powerless, but something claimed and earned through determination and strategic action. In the decades after her death, as the 20th century unfolded and a new civil rights movement began to gather momentum, Evelyn's story would be invoked again and again as an inspiration and a proof. Freedom fighters, activists, and ordinary people seeking to understand how to resist injustice would reflect on the case of a woman who had not waited for justice to be granted, but had engineered the conditions for her own freedom and the vindication of her humanity. Her descendants continued to tell her story. Ruth's daughter became a teacher and a community organizer. Thomas's grandsons became civil rights advocates and scholars, and through their efforts, Evelyn's name, which had nearly been lost to history, was preserved and restored. Educational programs were established to teach her story to children who would grow up knowing that their ancestors had possessed not merely survival instincts, but sophisticated strategic minds capable of outmaneuvering those who held power over them. The plantation at Briar Hollow, which had fallen into ruin, eventually passed into the hands of historians and preservationists. It became a site of historical education and memory. Visitors would walk through the decaying great house and learn about the complex history of slavery and liberation that had occurred within its walls. They would learn about Master Alcott and his fall from grace. They would learn about the woman who had served him and outwitted him, who had disappeared and returned transformed. What is remarkable about Evelyn's story, when viewed across the span of a century and more, is not merely that she survived slavery and escape and built a successful life in freedom. These accomplishments are extraordinary enough, but what truly distinguishes her legacy is the way she recognized, even while enslaved, that intelligence and strategy were more powerful than force, that patience could serve as well as haste, that the most devastating form of resistance sometimes looks like quiet, deliberate action rather than dramatic rebellion. She understood something that many in positions of power have never grasped, that systems of oppression are ultimately dependent on the complicity and cooperation of those who are oppressed. The moment that cooperation is withdrawn, the moment that the enslaved person recognizes their own agency and acts upon it, the system begins to fail. Evelyn did not merely act. She acted with such intelligence and such precision that she demonstrated the vulnerability of the very system that had tried to erase her humanity. In the modern era, historians and scholars continue to study Evelyn's case, though the historical record regarding her is fragmentary and incomplete. No comprehensive autobiography exists written entirely in her own hand. No journals survive documenting her daily thoughts and feelings. Yet enough evidence remains in the letters she wrote, in the testimony of those who knew her, in the public records of her children's lives and accomplishments, to piece together the outlines of an extraordinary human being. What emerges from this fragmentary record is a portrait of a woman whose greatest strength was not physical but intellectual. She had been forced by circumstances to become a student of systems, of power, of the psychology of those who wielded it. She had learned to observe minutely and to act with precision. She had understood that her oppressor's greatest vulnerability lay not in his physical power but in his conscience, in the part of him that knew, however deeply buried, that what he was doing was wrong. By returning and by making her freedom and her children's freedom undeniably visible, she forced that conscience to confront itself. She made it impossible for him to maintain the fiction that his benevolence was enough. In the final analysis, Evelyn's legacy is not merely personal or even familial. It is philosophical. It teaches us something essential about the nature of freedom and the mechanisms of its attainment. It demonstrates that freedom is not something that flows down from the powerful to the powerless as an act of mercy or enlightenment. Freedom is something that must be seized by the powerless themselves, through their own intelligence, their own courage, and their own determination to reclaim the humanity that systems of oppression seek to deny. In the gathering darkness of any unjust system, there are always people like Evelyn, people who pay attention, who think strategically, who refuse to accept the definitions of themselves that the powerful seek to impose. These people, by the simple act of claiming their own agency and their own worth, become architects of change far larger than themselves. They demonstrate to all who come after them that even the most absolute seeming power can be challenged and ultimately overthrown through the exercise of human intelligence, dignity, and will. More than a century after her death, Evelyn's story continues to inspire because it speaks to something timeless in the human experience: the desire for freedom, the exercise of courage, the triumph of intellect and determination over systems designed to crush them. In her story, we see not merely a woman who escaped slavery, but a woman who understood that true liberation required not just physical freedom, but the reclamation of one's own mind, one's own dignity, one's own authority over one's own life and destiny. Her children thrived, her grandchildren became leaders, her great-grandchildren grew up in a world forever changed by her actions, even if many of them would never know the details of her story. And those of us who come generations after her, living in a world she helped to shape, carry forward the knowledge that one person, armed with intelligence, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice, can indeed change the course of history, can indeed plant seeds that will grow into forests, can indeed demonstrate that humanity, once truly awakened to its own possibilities, can never again be fully subjugated. This is the legacy of Evelyn, a legacy not of grand violence or dramatic rebellion, but of quiet, determined, strategic action that revealed the profound vulnerability of a system that had seemed immovable. It is a legacy that continues to speak across the years to anyone who seeks to understand how to resist oppression, how to reclaim stolen dignity, how to engineer freedom when it is not granted, and it remains to this day a powerful reminder that the human spirit, when it is truly resolved, contains within it capacities for resilience, ingenuity, and transformation that are simply unstoppable.